Before the world was fractured by trenches and stained by mustard gas, there was an old world, a world of empires, and the most bewildering, the most splendid, and the most fragile of them all was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It wasn't a nation in the way we understand it today. It was a living museum of peoples, a vast European territory ruled by the ancient House of Habsburg, a dynasty that had shaped the continent for 600 years. From the gilded ballrooms of Vienna to the fertile plains of Hungary and the rugged mountains of the Balkans, this empire was a delicate balancing act. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Italians, and a dozen other nationalities lived under a single crown, held together by tradition, bureaucracy, and the unshakable authority of one man, Emperor Franz Joseph I. By the 1860s, he had been on the throne for what seemed like an eternity. He was the embodiment of duty, a figure more monument than man, who saw change not as progress, but as a threat. His empire was a magnificent facade, but beneath the surface the foundations were cracking. The forces of nationalism, the dangerous, seductive idea that each people deserved its own nation, were tearing at the seams of his multi-ethnic realm. This was the world that was waiting, a gilded cage on the brink of collapse. And into this world, on the 18th of December, 1863, a boy was born who was never supposed to rule it. His name was Franz Ferdinand. His birth in the city of Graz was a relatively minor event in the grand scheme of the Habsburg dynasty. He was the eldest son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, the emperor's younger brother. This placed him firmly in the imperial orbit, but far from its center. The line of succession was clear, and everyone believed secure. Emperor Franz Joseph had a son, the Crown Prince Rudolf, a boy who was being meticulously groomed to inherit the vast empire. Franz Ferdinand was at best third in line, a spare part in the imperial machine destined for the comfortable but ultimately unremarkable life of a minor archduke. His father, Karl Ludwig, was a pious and deeply conservative man, known more for his devotion to the Catholic Church than for any political acumen. He was, by all accounts, a simple man in a complex role who once allegedly tried to drink the holy water from the River Jordan and contracted typhoid. His mother, Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon Two Sicilies, was a more tragic figure. A frail and melancholic woman, she was plagued by relentless illness, a shadow that would stretch long over her children's lives. She brought with her not just the prestigious blood of the Neapolitan Bourbons, but a hereditary curse that would secretly define her eldest son's existence: tuberculosis. Franz Ferdinand's childhood was one of privilege, but not of warmth. The Habsburg court was governed by the suffocatingly rigid Spanish court etiquette, a labyrinth of rules dictating every gesture, every word, every interaction. It was a world that prized form over feeling, discipline over affection. He and his siblings were raised not by their parents, but by a phalanx of tutors, governors, and servants. He was heavily influenced by the historian Onno Klopp, who instilled in him a deep sense of Habsburg destiny, a belief in the divine right of kings, and a profound suspicion of liberalism, democracy, and the rising tide of nationalism. His education was designed to produce a loyal supporter of the crown, a pillar of the establishment, not a future ruler. But two unforeseen events in his youth would shatter this predictable trajectory, setting him on a path he never chose. The first came not from the heart of Vienna, but from Italy. In 1875, a distant, childless relative, Francis V, the deposed Duke of Modena, died. He was the last of the Este line, a once powerful Italian noble house. In his will, he named the 11-year-old Franz Ferdinand his sole heir, on the condition that the boy adopt Este as part of his name. Overnight, the young Archduke became Archduke Franz Ferdinand von Österreich-Este, and with the name came a fortune of almost unimaginable scale. He inherited vast estates in Italy and Austria, palaces, priceless art collections that included works by the old masters, and a liquid fortune worth millions. This inheritance was the first secret of his power. It made him financially independent from the emperor's court, a rarity for an archduke. He could fund his own lifestyle, his own travels, his own political ambitions, without ever needing to ask the emperor for a crown. This wealth would later give him the courage to defy the most powerful man in his world. The second event was not a gift, but a curse secretly passed down from his mother. By the time he was in his late teens, the tuberculosis that had claimed Maria Annunziata began to manifest in her son. It started subtly, a persistent cough, a recurring fever, a growing weariness. By his early 20s, the symptoms were undeniable and terrifying. He was suffering from pulmonary hemorrhages, coughing up blood in episodes that left him weak and gasping for air. In the 19th century, tuberculosis, the White Plague, was a death sentence. For a potential heir to the Habsburg throne, a dynasty that prized physical perfection and military vigor, it was a catastrophic weakness. It was a secret that had to be guarded at all cost. To admit such a flaw would mean being cast aside, deemed unfit for duty, and removed from any consideration for the succession. So began a life of concealment. He embarked on a series of long, secretive cures, disguised as naval training or recreational travel. He was sent to the warm, salty air of the Adriatic, spending months on islands like Lochinge or to the deserts of Egypt. These were not holidays. They were desperate battles for survival, fought in private, away from the gossip and political maneuvering of the Viennese court. This constant, hidden struggle with mortality profoundly shaped his character. It explains the impatience, the famous irascibility, the volcanic temper that would become his trademark. He felt he was living on borrowed time, and it gave him a deep-seated contempt for the trivialities and endless protocol of court life. While others saw decades stretching before them, he saw a ticking clock. And then, on a freezing January morning in 1889, the entire future of the empire was shattered. At a remote hunting lodge called Meerling, the heir to the throne, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead alongside his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vitsera. The official story was a heart aneurysm, a clumsy lie that no one believed. The truth was far darker, a murder-suicide pact, born of despair. The Meerling incident was more than a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic cataclysm. The liberal, progressive Rudolf, the only son of the emperor, was gone. The line of succession, once a straight and certain path, was now a fractured road. First in line became Franz Ferdinand's father, the aging Karl Ludwig, and directly after him stood Franz Ferdinand himself. The sickly, ill-tempered Archduke, the man fighting a secret war with a deadly disease, was now just one heartbeat away from becoming the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The establishment was aghast. The idea that this difficult, unpredictable man could one day rule was, to many, a terrifying prospect. With his new, unwelcome proximity to the throne came increased scrutiny and responsibility. He was expected to be a global ambassador for the empire, and in 1892, he embarked on the most ambitious journey of his life, a scientific expedition around the world. It was officially a mission to expand the Imperial Museum's collections, but for Franz Ferdinand, it was something more. It was a final grand escape before the gilded cage of his destiny closed around him, and a secret intelligence-gathering mission to understand how the world's other great powers ran their empires. His journey, meticulously documented in his diary, reveals a man of intense curiosity and deep contradictions. He sailed from the Adriatic port of Trieste, heading east. In India, he was both fascinated and repulsed by what he saw. He marveled at the splendor of the British Raj, but was contemptuous of the British colonial administrators, whom he saw as arrogant, and held the Indian population in a racist disregard typical of his era. And of course he hunted. He hunted tigers and elephants with a ferocious intensity. His diary entries, often shifting from detailed ethnographic observations to cold, numerical accountings of the animals he had killed. From India, he sailed to Australia. In the outback, he was not a visiting royal, but an obsessive hunter. He gleefully shot kangaroos, emus, and anything else that moved, seeing the continent as a primitive playground. In one diary entry, he describes killing a kangaroo with a sense of brutal satisfaction, a glimpse into the violent obsession that would later define him. His journey took him through the islands of the Pacific, and then to a nation that truly captured his imagination, the newly modernized Japan. For a man from a centuries-old, slow-moving European dynasty, Japan in the 1890s was a revelation. He had witnessed the slow decay of ancient cultures under the boot of European colonialism. But here was a country that was doing the impossible. It was adopting Western technology, industry, and military science at a breathtaking pace, yet it was doing so on its own terms, without sacrificing its unique culture or, most importantly to him, its reverence for the emperor. He deeply admired this rapid, disciplined transformation. He saw in the Japanese a martial spirit, a respect for authority, and a national unity that he could only dream of for his own fractured empire. It was here, far from the prying eyes of the Viennese court, that Franz Ferdinand did something utterly out of character for a Habsburg Archduke, something that revealed a hidden, rebellious streak. He got himself a tattoo. It wasn't a small, discreet emblem, but a large, elaborate depiction of a dragon, its coils winding all the way up his arm. The act of a sailor, not a sovereign in waiting. It was a permanent souvenir of his journey, a secret piece of body art that symbolized his encounter with a world beyond the rigid confines of his own. Finally, he crossed the vast Pacific to North America. In Canada, he marveled at the immense, untamed wilderness of the Rockies, a hunter's paradise that spoke to his soul. He traveled the Canadian Pacific Railway, not just a tourist, but an observer deeply impressed by this feat of engineering that had tamed a continent, binding a nation together with ribbons of steel. Then he came to the United States. His time there was a study in contrast, a perfect encapsulation of his conflicting views on the modern world. First, he visited Yellowstone National Park, a place of stunning natural beauty. But it was his visit to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition that left the deepest impression. It was a dazzling spectacle of modernity and raw American ambition. He was genuinely impressed, even awestruck, by the scale of American industry and ingenuity. He saw the future in its towering structures and humming machinery. But he was simultaneously appalled by the society that had produced it. To a man raised in a world of strict hierarchy and absolute deference, American democracy was simply organized chaos. He found the people loud, the customs crass, and the lack of respect for authority utterly bewildering. He watched as streetcars, carriages, and pedestrians clogged the streets in a lawless scramble, a perfect metaphor, in his eyes, for a society without a firm hand to guide it. In his diary, he wrote with aristocratic disdain about a country where everything, even human relationships, seemed to be about money. He was impressed by what America built, but he was contemptuous of how America lived. He returned to Vienna in October 1893 after 10 months at sea, stepping off the ship a profoundly changed man. This wasn't the same Archduke who had left. The journey had been a political and personal education on a global scale. He had seen the world beyond the suffocating, inwardly focused confines of the Habsburg court. He had witnessed the British Empire's administrative grip on India, the commercial power of the French colonies, and the rising might of Japan and the United States. He now understood that the future of great powers would not be decided in the ballrooms of Vienna, but in naval dockyards, in industrial factories, and across the world's oceans. This new global perspective hardened his conviction that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with its creaking, outdated structures, needed radical reform if it was to survive and compete. The trip gave his frustrations a focus, transforming his ill-tempered critiques into a concrete vision for the future. He returned not as a minor archduke with opinions, but as a man with a vision, albeit a deeply authoritarian one. And with this new mental fortitude came a miraculous physical one. His health, which had been a constant secret shadow over his life, had dramatically improved. The long months of sea air and dry climate seemed to have arrested the progress of his tuberculosis, at least for a time. For a man who had spent his 20s living under a potential death sentence, this reprieve felt like a resurrection. He felt stronger, more vigorous, and filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He was ready to take on the duties that fate was relentlessly thrusting upon him. Then, in 1896, the final barrier in his path to the throne fell away. His father, Karl Ludwig, finally died. The end came, ironically, as a result of his almost medieval piety. He had contracted typhoid fever after insisting on drinking sanctified but untreated water from the River Jordan during a trip to the Holy Land. With his father's passing, the line of succession was now brutally simple. There was the old emperor, Franz Joseph, and then there was him. The last barrier was gone. Franz Ferdinand, the accidental heir, the man who was never supposed to be king, was now the official heir apparent to the throne of the last great Catholic empire in Europe. The full crushing weight of the title descended upon him. He was no longer just a wealthy archduke. He was the focal point for the hopes and fears of 50 million people. He was wealthy, he was headstrong, and he was armed with a secret radical agenda to save the empire from itself. But as he stood on the precipice of this immense public destiny, he was also carrying another secret. This one was new, and in the rigid world of the Habsburgs, it was far more dangerous than his politics or his illness. It was a secret he had discovered at a ball in Prague a year earlier, a fragile, hopeful thing that had taken root in his heart. It was a secret that would lead him to wage the most difficult and passionate battle of his life, not for an empire, but for a woman. It would force him to defy his emperor, scandalize a continent, and ultimately set him on a collision course with a 19-year-old assassin on a street corner in Sarajevo. He had fallen in love. And so, the stage was set for the greatest and most personal battle of Franz Ferdinand's life. Having returned from his journey around the globe, he was a man transformed, armed with a new vision for his empire and a renewed sense of his own destiny. He was the heir, a powerful and unpredictable force waiting in the wings. But all his grand political schemes, his military ambitions, and his secret plans for reform were about to be overshadowed by a crisis that would strike not at the borders of the empire, but at the heart of the man himself. This next chapter of his life would not be defined by maps or armies, but by a secret courtship, a forbidden love, and a defiant struggle against the ancient traditions that sought to command his heart. In 1894, Franz Ferdinand was a man forged by secrets. The secret of his vast wealth had given him independence. The secret of his chronic illness had given him a sense of borrowed time. And the secret of his travels had given him a radical vision for the future. He was now the heir to a sprawling, decaying empire, a man waiting in the wings, preparing for the role he was never supposed to have. But the greatest secret of his life was about to begin, not in a cabinet meeting or on a battlefield, but in the glittering swirl of a Prague ballroom. It was a secret that would force him to choose between a throne and the woman he loved, a battle that would reveal the true, unyielding core of this difficult and contradictory man. The woman who would upend an empire was Countess Sophie Chotek von Tchotkau und Wognin. She was a descendant of a noble but impoverished Bohemian family. In the rigid, almost fanatically class-conscious world of the Habsburg court, this made her a virtual nobody. She was not a princess, not an archduchess, not a suitable match for a butcher's son, let alone the future emperor. She was a lady-in-waiting to Archduchess Isabella, a respectable but subservient role, destined for a life in the shadow of her betters. It was at the estate of Archduchess Isabella that Franz Ferdinand was a frequent guest. The court gossips all knew the reason, or so they thought. The Archduchess had a flock of eligible daughters, and it was assumed the heir was surveying the flock, preparing to make a suitable, dynastically approved choice. He would come to play tennis, to attend dinners, to engage in polite conversation, but his eyes were not on the Archduchess's daughters. They were on her lady-in-waiting. Sophie was not a conventional beauty, but she was striking with a grace, intelligence, and quiet confidence that set her apart. For a man like Franz Ferdinand, who was surrounded by the simpering formalities of the court and the rigid etiquette he so despised, Sophie was a breath of fresh air. She was genuine. She was calm. She spoke to him not as a future emperor, but as a man. For 5 years, their love affair was a masterpiece of concealment. They exchanged secret letters, stole fleeting moments together during official functions, and used the Archduke's courtship of the other young women as a perfect cover. According to a widely told anecdote, the secret was finally broken by a moment of pure theatrical drama. One day, Franz Ferdinand carelessly left his pocket watch lying on a table during a tennis match. Archduchess Isabella, consumed by a mother's ambition, picked it up. Like many lockets of the time, it had a space for a photograph. Convinced she would find the face of her eldest daughter, Marie Christine, inside, she snapped it open. But the face that stared back at her was not her daughter's. It was the face of her lady-in-waiting, Sophie Chotek. The fury of Archduchess Isabella was immediate and explosive. Sophie was dismissed instantly, her reputation in tatters. The scandal ripped through the Viennese court. It was one thing for an archduke to have a discreet affair with a commoner. It was another thing entirely for the heir to the throne to be genuinely in love with one and to seemingly intend to marry her. The full crushing weight of the Habsburg dynasty came down on Franz Ferdinand. When the scandal of the locket broke, the reaction from his uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph, was not one of mere disapproval. It was one of pure, cold fury. He was apoplectic. To understand the depth of the old emperor's rage, you have to understand the man himself. By this point, in his long reign, Franz Joseph had been weathered by an almost unimaginable series of personal tragedies. His brother Maximilian had been executed by a firing squad in Mexico. His only son and heir, Rudolf, had died in the infamous Mayerling suicide pact. His beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, had been assassinated by an anarchist. In the face of this relentless loss, the emperor had clung with grim tenacity to the one thing that remained: order, tradition, and the sacred, unbreakable rules of the dynasty. For him, these rules weren't just dusty protocol. They were the very bones of the empire, the only thing holding it together in a chaotic world. The Habsburg motto for centuries had been Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria, nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Their power was built not on conquest, but on strategic dynastic marriages. This wasn't just a matter of romance, it was a matter of state, of order, of the sacred purity of the imperial bloodline. For the heir to this ancient throne to propose marrying a mere countess was, in the emperor's eyes, a betrayal of this iron law. It was an act of personal rebellion that threatened the very foundation of their power. It was a public humiliation, a sign that the last pillars of his world were beginning to crumble. In a cold, tense meeting within the stone walls of the Hofburg, he forbade the union in the strongest possible terms. He ordered Franz Ferdinand to end it immediately and unconditionally. And here, in this moment of crisis, the world saw the man Franz Ferdinand truly was. He was not the pliable nephew the emperor might have hoped for. The same stubborn, defiant streak that his lonely illness had forged in him now came to the fore, hardened into an unbreakable resolve. He refused. The court threw everything it had at him. It was a campaign of pressure and persuasion that lasted for 2 long, agonizing years. They offered him everything to give Sophie up. Lists of suitably royal German princesses were paraded before him. He was told he could have any other bride, any title, any fortune. There were even back-channel offers suggesting that Sophie could be made a princess and given a castle of her own, if only she would gracefully disappear and allow the Archduke to do his duty. But to Franz Ferdinand, this was unthinkable. His relationship with Sophie wasn't a dalliance to be discarded. It was the anchor of his life. He turned it all down. He dug in his heels, engaging in a silent 2-year war of wills with the most powerful man in his world. It was a period of intense isolation. He and Sophie were social pariahs. Dinners were icy. Conversations were strained. The entire machinery of the imperial court was mobilized to break him, but he would not break. Finally, it is widely believed he played his ultimate card, threatening to renounce his claim to the throne altogether. This was no idle threat. It was a move that would have thrown the already fragile empire into a catastrophic succession crisis. The next in line after Franz Ferdinand was his younger brother, the notoriously dissolute Archduke Otto, a man known for his drunken scandals and philandering, including an incident where he was seen in the hallway of the Sacher Hotel wearing nothing but a sword. The thought of Otto the Handsome as the future emperor was a nightmare that terrified the establishment even more than Franz Ferdinand's unsuitable marriage. His threat was credible, and it was a checkmate. Finally, seeing his nephew would rather break the empire than break his bond with Sophie, the old emperor relented. But it was not a gracious surrender. It was a capitulation that came with conditions that were deliberately cruel, designed to be a permanent public reminder of the woman's inferior status. The marriage would be morganatic. It was a legal term, but it was a social dagger. The word itself comes from an old Germanic term for a mourning gift, the token property a husband gave his wife the day after their wedding, which was all she was legally entitled to. It was a mechanism for a high-born man to marry a lower-born woman without granting her or their children any of his titles or inheritance rights. For the heir to the imperial throne, it was an unprecedented humiliation. It meant that while Sophie would be his wife, she would never ever share his rank. She would not be empress. She would not be archduchess. She would be granted a lesser, almost meaningless title, cobbled together for the occasion. Princess of Hohenberg. This new title forbade her from appearing beside him at most state occasions, from sitting in the imperial box at the opera, and from riding in the same royal carriage in a procession. And the most painful cut of all was aimed at the future, at the family they dreamed of having. On the 28th of June, 1900, Franz Ferdinand was summoned to the hall of the Privy Council in the Hofburg Palace. Before the assembled archdukes of the imperial family, the ministers of the government, and his grim-faced old uncle, he was forced to perform an act of profound personal shame. Standing before a crucifix, he had to publicly read and sign an official oath, an act that was broadcast to the entire empire. He had to solemnly swear on his honor that he was renouncing all rights of succession for any children he might have with Sophie. In that cold, silent room, he was forced to publicly disinherit his own unborn sons. Their wedding, held a few days later on July 1st, was a sad, strained affair. It took place not in a grand Viennese cathedral, but in the small chapel of a provincial castle in Bohemia. The emperor did not attend. None of Franz Ferdinand's brothers were there. It was a union born of a great and defiant love, but it was consecrated in humiliation. And for the next 14 years, Sophie would endure 1,000 daily slights, the cold shoulders and whispered insults of a court that would never accept her. The court's chief master of ceremonies, Prince Montenuovo, was a personal enemy of Franz Ferdinand, and he took an almost sadistic pleasure in enforcing every petty rule designed to put Sophie in her place. At state banquets, she would be seated far down the table, below the youngest teenage archduchess. When a royal procession was organized, she would be forced to walk alone, far behind the rest of the family. At the court theater, she was not permitted to sit in the imperial box next to her husband. A separate, smaller box had to be constructed for her off to the side, a public display of her exclusion. This deep, unrelenting injustice fueled a burning resentment in Franz Ferdinand. Every insult to his wife was a personal wound, a fresh log on the fire of his contempt for the Viennese establishment. His political desire to reform the empire was now fused with a personal vendetta against the courtiers and politicians who had so wounded the person he loved most. His desire to one day tear down the old, rigid structures of the court was no longer just a political calculation. It was a promise he had made to himself, a score he intended to settle. While his private life was consumed by this battle for love, his public life was becoming a rehearsal for power. As the heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand began to operate what was essentially a government in waiting, a circle of advisors that historians now often refer to as a shadow court, based out of his military chancellery at his official residence, the Belvedere Palace in Vienna. He gathered around him a circle of loyal advisors, military officers, and politicians who shared his belief that the empire was on a path to ruin and needed a strong authoritarian hand to save it. This Belvedere circle became the nerve center for his radical secret agenda, and the core of that agenda was the destruction of the political system that had governed the empire since 1867, the Dual Monarchy. Franz Ferdinand harbored a visceral, all-consuming hatred for the Hungarian political elite. He saw them as arrogant, corrupt, and relentlessly selfish, a group that blackmailed the crown to maintain their own dominance over the other ethnic groups within the Hungarian half of the empire, the Croats, Slovaks, and Romanians. His secret plan was revolutionary. Not in a democratic sense, Franz Ferdinand despised the will of the masses, but revolutionary in its sheer audacity, in its willingness to shatter the very foundations upon which the empire had rested for half a century. To understand the danger of his idea, you have to understand the poison that was slowly killing Austria-Hungary from within. the Compromise of 1867. This was the deal that had created the Dual Monarchy, splitting the empire into two halves, an Austrian part and a Hungarian part, united only by a shared monarch, army, and foreign policy. In theory, it created stability. In practice, it had handed immense power to the Hungarian political elite, the Magyars, and they used that power to ruthlessly dominate the other ethnic groups trapped within their borders. Through a harsh policy known as Magyarization, they suppressed the languages and cultures of the Croats, Slovaks, Romanians, and Serbs under their rule. They were a powerful, privileged class, and they saw any attempt to change this status quo not just as a political disagreement, but as a threat to their very existence. Franz Ferdinand saw this situation with cold, clear eyes. He hated the Hungarians with a passion that bordered on obsession, viewing them as arrogant, unreliable separatists who were bleeding the empire dry. He believed the only way to save the empire was to break their power completely. He intended, upon ascending the throne, to unilaterally smash the dualist system. His ascension would be a constitutional coup d'etat. He would use the military, an institution loyal to the emperor, not to politicians, to crush any Hungarian resistance and impose a new federal structure on the empire. His most favored model was a form of trialism, a concept that sent shivers down the spine of every politician in Budapest. It would create a third, South Slavic political entity within the empire, with its own parliament and administration, likely centered in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. This would unite the Croats, Slovenes, and Bosnian Serbs under one banner, elevating them to a position of near equality with the Germans and the Hungarians. In one clean stroke, the Hungarian stranglehold on power would be broken forever. But in other, more ambitious moments, his vision went even further. He and his circle of advisors at the Belvedere Palace, a group of military men and intellectuals, often called his shadow government, envisioned a United States of Greater Austria. This idea, heavily influenced by thinkers like the Romanian politician Aro Popovici, was breathtaking in its scope. It would dissolve the old historic crowns and redraw the internal map of the empire into a federation of up to 15 autonomous ethnically based states. There would be a state for the Czechs, one for the Slovaks, one for the Poles, and so on, each with control over its own local culture and language, but all bound together under the central authoritarian rule of the emperor himself. These were dangerous, incendiary ideas. The Hungarian government, led by the iron-willed Prime Minister Count István Tisza, a man who was Franz Ferdinand's political arch-nemesis, saw him as a mortal enemy. They used their political power to block his military budgets and thwart his ambitions at every turn, all while their spies worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of his plans. The old Emperor Franz Joseph, a man who prized stability above all else, was also made deeply uneasy by his heir's radicalism. He had spent his entire reign trying to hold the fragile compromise together, and here was his successor planning to tear it all down. But these plans reveal the central paradox of Franz Ferdinand. He was a committed autocrat who hated democracy, yet his plan might have solved the empire's greatest problem, the nationalist aspirations of its Slavic subjects. His motives were not born of a progressive belief in self-determination. It was a cold, calculated strategy of divide and conquer. By empowering the Slavic peoples, he would make them loyal subjects, their allegiance sworn directly to him and the imperial crown in Vienna, not to their nationalist leaders, or worse, to outside agitators. This was especially true regarding the empire's most volatile border. By giving the Slavs inside his empire autonomy and a better life, he hoped to neutralize the appeal of the neighboring kingdom of Serbia, which dreamed of creating a greater Serbia by inciting rebellion and tearing away the empire's Balkan provinces. It is one of history's most bitter ironies. The man who would be murdered by a Serb nationalist was the only Habsburg leader with a concrete, albeit self-serving, plan to satisfy Slavic ambitions and thus pacify the Serbian threat. This is precisely why he, unlike the generals around him, consistently warned against a preemptive war with Serbia. His chief of staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, was a man obsessed, constantly petitioning for a preventative war to crush Serbia before it became too strong. Franz Ferdinand always refused. It was not pacifism that guided him, but chilling pragmatism. He knew the army was not ready for a major multi-front war. More importantly, he knew a war with Serbia would be a war with its great protector, Russia. He once famously warned a minister, "War with Russia means our end. Should the emperor and the czar knock one another from their thrones, they will open the way for revolution." It was a prophecy of terrifying accuracy. His influence grew immensely when he was appointed Inspector General of the Armed Forces in 1913. This role gave him the authority he needed to begin turning his vision into reality. He threw himself into the monumental task of modernizing the army, a force steeped in tradition and plagued by inefficiency. He fought to introduce new machine guns and modern artillery, streamline mobilization plans, and root out the ceremonial deadwood in the officer corps. But his true passion was the Navy. For an empire that was largely landlocked, this seemed an odd priority, but for Franz Ferdinand, it was pure strategic and symbolic genius. He championed the construction of a new fleet of powerful Dreadnought-class battleships, believing a strong navy was essential to projecting Habsburg power in the Adriatic Sea, countering the ambitions of Italy, and proving that Austria-Hungary was a modern, global power. His flagship, the magnificent SMS Viribus Unitas, Latin for "with united forces," was his personal pride and joy. The very name was a declaration of his political philosophy, a floating symbol of the unified, centralized empire he dreamed of leading. In this military buildup, he had a powerful ally and complex friend, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II. The two men were, in many ways, kindred spirits. They shared a deep love for the military, for the spectacle of naval reviews and grand parades, and a mutual frustration with the messy business of democratic politics. They met frequently, hunting together and discussing the future of Europe. The Kaiser saw in Franz Ferdinand what he wanted to see, a strong, decisive leader who could finally whip the ramshackle Austrian Empire into a formidable military partner for Germany. Berlin saw Franz Ferdinand as their man, the key to solidifying the Triple Alliance. Yet while Wilhelm was famously impulsive and aggressive, Franz Ferdinand often acted as a brake, his private pragmatism tempering his publicly harsh rhetoric. Theirs was a friendship built on mutual interest, but it was a dangerous one, tying the fate of Vienna ever more tightly to the ambitions of Berlin. The constant political battles, the suffocating court etiquette in Vienna, and the weight of his future responsibilities took a tremendous toll. To escape it all, Franz Ferdinand created his own private world at Konopishta Castle, a magnificent medieval fortress in Bohemia that he had purchased and lavishly renovated with his Este inheritance. Konopishta was more than a home. It was his sanctuary, his personal kingdom, a counter Vienna where his rules applied. He poured a fortune into it, installing electricity, hydraulic elevators, and modern plumbing, a testament to his fascination with technology. Here, Far from the prying eyes of the court that had so cruelly ostracized his wife, he could finally live as he wished. At Konopishta, the grim, irritable heir vanished. In his place was a devoted husband to the wife he adored, and a doting, surprisingly modern father to their 3 children, Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst. This was the one place on earth where Sophie Chotek was not the morganatic wife, the humiliated princess of Hohenberg, but the undisputed lady of the castle, treated by her husband and all who worked there as the empress of their private domain. He broke with stuffy Habsburg tradition, allowing his children to dine at the table with him and encouraging a more relaxed, affectionate family atmosphere than he had ever known. He taught his sons to hunt and his daughter to garden. The rare photographs from this period are striking. While other royal families posed in stiff, formal arrangements, the pictures from Konopishta show a genuine warmth, a man at ease only in the company of the family he had fought the world to have. This deep private joy was the fuel for his public battles, the secret heart of the rebel and the reformer, and it was this profound love for his family that would ultimately lead him to accept a fateful invitation to a city called Sarajevo. Here, the great contradiction of his character was on full display. This loving family man was also a killer on an industrial scale. The grounds of Konopishta were his personal hunting ground, and the castle itself became a grotesque monument to his obsession. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with over 100,000 hunting trophies. His personal diaries are a chilling, methodical record of slaughter, with a tally that is often cited as a staggering 272,511 animals killed over the course of his life. This was not sport, it was a pathology, a need to exert absolute dominance and control, perhaps an outlet for the political frustrations and personal humiliations he was forced to endure. This violent obsession nearly ended his life a year before the assassin's bullet did. In November 1913, he was a guest at a hunting party at Welbeck Abbey in England, hosted by the Duke of Portland. During one of the shoots, a loader's gun accidentally discharged. The shot flew just past the Archduke's head, so close that he felt the heat of it. For a moment, history held its breath. Had that shot been a few inches to the side, the heir to the throne would have died in a hunting accident. The pretext for the First World War would have vanished, and the 20th century might have taken an entirely different course. But fate, it seemed, had a more dramatic and terrible end in store for him. By the spring of 1914, Franz Ferdinand stood at the peak of his power and influence. He had won his war for love. His family was a source of deep joy. His shadow government at the Belvedere was finalizing the plans for his future reign. The old emperor was 84 and failing. It was only a matter of time. He had powerful enemies, yes, but he was on the verge of inheriting the power to crush them all and remake an empire in his own image. In June, a fateful invitation arrived. He was asked to travel to the distant restive province of Bosnia-Herzegovina to observe military maneuvers. The capital city was a place called Sarajevo. The trip offered a rare and precious opportunity. Because he would be there in his military capacity as Inspector General, the rigid rules of the Viennese court would not apply. For once, his wife Sophie would be allowed to appear in public at his side, to share in the official honors, to be treated not as a disgraced countess, but as the cherished partner of the heir to the throne. Many historians believe his decision to accept was deeply personal. The trip was scheduled for June 28th, the anniversary of the humiliating oath he swore to marry Sophie. This visit to Sarajevo, where she would be afforded full public honors, is seen by many as his anniversary gift to her, a chance to give her the recognition the Viennese court so cruelly denied her. And so, all the threads of his life, the political struggles, the military duties, and the deep abiding love for his wife, converged on a single point on the map. The journey to Sarajevo was meant to be a moment of triumph, a public affirmation of the private happiness he had fought so hard to win. He was the powerful heir, the inspector general of the armed forces, visiting the restive southern edge of his future domain. But in the shadows of that same city, another group of men, fueled by a nationalism he had sought to pacify, were preparing a very different kind of reception. The final act of Franz Ferdinand's improbable life was about to begin, not in a palace or on a battlefield, but on a sunlit street corner where fate, politics, and a single wrong turn were about to collide with catastrophic force. Sarajevo. In the summer of 1914, it was an exotic, restive outpost at the southeastern edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The province of Bosnia-Herzegovina had only been officially annexed 6 years earlier, a move that enraged the neighboring kingdom of Serbia, which saw the region and its large Serb population as rightfully its own. The city was a known hotbed of anti-Habsburg sentiment, a place simmering with the fervent, dangerous passions of Slavic nationalism. For the heir to the Habsburg throne to visit this city was a risk. To do so on June 28th was a deliberate provocation. June 28th is Vidovdan, or St. Vitus's Day. To the Serbs, it is the most sacred and solemn day in their national calendar. It is the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, where a Serbian army made a heroic last stand against the invading Ottoman Empire. It is a day of martyrdom, of sacrifice, of a centuries-old dream of independence. For Franz Ferdinand and his entourage to schedule a grand military parade through the heart of Sarajevo on that specific day was seen by nationalists not as a coincidence, but as a calculated insult, the Austrian eagle deliberately flexing its power on a day of Serbian sorrow. But for Franz Ferdinand, the date was significant for another deeply personal reason. June 28th was the 14th anniversary of the humiliating oath of renunciation he had been forced to swear to marry his beloved Sophie. The trip to Sarajevo, where she would be afforded full honors at his side, was his anniversary gift to her, a public declaration of her importance, a defiant gesture to the Viennese court that had scorned her. He was risking his life in a hostile city, in large part, to honor his wife. It was a decision born of love, and it would doom them both. While the Archduke planned his anniversary gesture, another group of young men were planning something far more sinister. They were members of a radical nationalist group called Young Bosnia, armed and trained by a shadowy Serbian secret society known as the Black Hand. Their leader was the chief of Serbian military intelligence, a man named Dragutin Dimitrijević, known as Apis. The goal of the Black Hand was the creation of a greater Serbia, and they saw Franz Ferdinand, the reformer, the man whose federalist plans might pacify the Slavs and permanently secure Bosnia for Austria, as the greatest single threat to that dream. He had to be eliminated. The assassins were little more than boys, filled with revolutionary fervor and a romantic nihilistic desire for martyrdom. Many of them, including the man who would fire the fatal shot, Gavrilo Princip, were suffering from the same disease that had haunted Franz Ferdinand his entire life, tuberculosis. They were young men in a hurry, convinced they had nothing to lose, who saw in the assassination of a tyrant their one great chance to make a mark on history. Armed with bombs and pistols, from Belgrade, they took up their positions along the announced parade route in Sarajevo, waiting for the heir. The morning of June 28, 1914, dawned bright and sunny. Security for the visit was shockingly, almost criminally, inept. The Archduke's motorcade consisted of just 6 open-topped cars. There were only 120 policemen to control the cheering, surging crowds along the several-mile route. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat in the second car, smiling and waving, the top folded down to give the people a better view. They were exposed, vulnerable, a perfect target. As the motorcade drove along the Appel Quay, which ran parallel to the Miljacka River, the first assassin, Nedeljko Čabrinović, struck. He threw his bomb, but it had a 10-second delay. It bounced off the folded-back roof of the Archduke's car, tumbled into the street, and exploded under the vehicle behind them, wounding 2 officers and several bystanders. The street erupted into chaos and smoke. Čabrinović swallowed a faulty cyanide pill and jumped into the shallow river, where he was quickly captured. The other assassins, hearing the explosion and the ensuing confusion, lost their nerve and melted back into the crowd. The plot, it seemed, had failed. The motorcade sped away, racing towards the safety of the town hall. Franz Ferdinand was incandescent with rage. Upon arriving, he brushed aside the mayor's prepared speech, snapping, "Mr. Mayor, I come here as your guest, and you people greet me with bombs. It is outrageous." After several tense minutes, he regained his composure. Sophie, despite the shock, insisted on staying by his side. A decision was made. They would scrap the rest of the day's schedule and visit the officers wounded by the bomb in the hospital. And here, in a moment of tragic incompetence, history turned. The officials decided to alter the route to the hospital to avoid the crowded city center, but no one thought to tell the driver of the lead car. Following the original publicly announced plan, the driver turned off the Appel Quay and onto the narrow Franz Joseph Street. A senior officer in the car, General Potiorek, began shouting at him, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." The driver, confused, slammed on the brakes. The large Graf and stiff touring car had no reverse gear. It stalled just feet from the corner. The driver began to try and push the heavy vehicle backward. It was at that exact improbable moment that Gavrilo Princip, who had given up and walked to a nearby delicatessen, looked up. He could not believe his eyes. The failed plot, the random chance of a wrong turn, had delivered his target directly to him. The Archduke's car was stalled, motionless, less than 5 feet away. Princip wasted no time. He stepped forward from the curb, raised his FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots. He later claimed the first was for the Archduke, the second for General Potiorek. But fate guided the bullets. The first shot struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, tearing his jugular vein. The second, flying wild, struck Sophie in the abdomen. For a moment, no one seemed to realize what had happened. Sophie looked at her husband, then slumped over, her face falling between his knees. Franz Ferdinand, still upright, initially thought she had fainted from the shock. He cradled her, pleading with her, his voice choked with blood. An aide heard his final heartbreaking words, not a curse on his enemies, or a proclamation for his empire, but a desperate whisper to his wife. So Ferl, sterbe nicht. Bleib am Leben für unsere Kinder, Sophie, dear, don't die. Stay alive for our children. As the car sped towards the governor's residence, a trickle of blood appeared at the Archduke's mouth. When asked if he was in pain, he managed to repeat, "It is nothing," over and over, until he lost consciousness. Sophie was dead before they arrived. The Archduke died minutes later. The great love affair that had defied an empire had ended together, in a pool of blood on a forgotten street corner. The news of the double assassination was met not with a wave of grief in Vienna, but with a chilling, almost indifferent calm. There were no grand outpourings of sorrow for the difficult, unpopular heir. The reaction of the emperor, Franz Joseph, was famously cold. He reportedly stated that a higher power has restored the order which I, unfortunately, was unable to maintain. To the old guard, the death of the radical reformer and his unsuitable wife was not a catastrophe, but a problem solved. Even in death, Sophie was not spared the court's cruelty. At their funeral service in Vienna, her coffin was placed on a catafalque slightly lower than her husband's, a final petty insistence on her inferior rank. But for the war party in the government, led by Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold and the chief of the General Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf, the assassination was not a tragedy, but a golden opportunity. It was the perfect pretext to finally launch the punitive war against Serbia they had long desired. They secured a promise of unconditional support from their powerful ally Germany, the infamous blank check. On July 23rd, they sent a deliberately humiliating ultimatum to Serbia, filled with demands they knew could never be met. When Serbia, as expected, refused to accept every single point, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination. The dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Russia, the great protector of the Slavic peoples, mobilized its army to defend Serbia. Germany, in response, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, was drawn in. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium to attack France, Great Britain declared war on Germany. Within a week, the intricate web of alliances had dragged the great powers of Europe into a war. The bullet that killed Franz Ferdinand had become the spark that set the world on fire. The war that followed was a cataclysm beyond anyone's imagination. It lasted 4 years and claimed the lives of 16 million people. It brought empires crashing down. The Russian, the Ottoman, and the German empires all vanished. And so too did the 600-year-old Habsburg realm. Franz Ferdinand's Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very thing his radical plans had been designed to save, was shattered into a dozen new countries, its legacy dissolving in the bitter tide of defeat. The tragic consequences echoed even into the next generation. Franz Ferdinand's children, Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst, the ones he had begged their mother to live for, were stripped of their titles and property after the war. As staunch Austrian patriots who opposed the rise of Nazism, his 2 sons were arrested by the Gestapo after Hitler annexed Austria in 1938. As special prisoners, they were sent to the Dachau concentration camp. There, the sons of the murdered Archduke were subjected to endless humiliations, forced to scrub the latrines of the SS barracks. They survived the war, broken men, a living tragic footnote to their parents' story. So we are left with the great unanswerable question: what if the driver hadn't taken that wrong turn? What if Franz Ferdinand had lived to become emperor? Could his United States of Greater Austria have saved the empire, pacifying the nationalists and preventing the Great War? Or would his authoritarian methods have simply sparked a civil war? We will never know. Most historians agree that the great powers were already on a collision course, and that the assassination was merely the pretext, not the ultimate cause. But the death of Franz Ferdinand did 2 things. It removed a powerful, if difficult, voice that had consistently warned against a war with Russia, and it provided the perfect justification for those who craved that very war. He remains one of history's most tragic figures, a man of profound contradictions. He was a loving husband who is a pathological killer of animals, an arch-conservative autocrat whose political vision was in its own way revolutionary, an anti-war advocate whose death was used to start the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. His life was a battle against the rigid traditions of an ancient court, and his death was the catalyst that brought that entire world crashing down. He is remembered as the first casualty of the First World War, but the truth is far more complex. He was the last great hope of a dying empire, a hated heir whose secret life and public death shaped the dawn of our modern violent age.